Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting schillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Ilya Shapiro, Senior Fellow and Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute and author of the new book, Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites. Ilya Shapiro, thanks for joining us on the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Good to be with you.
Let's talk about the corruption of American higher education. I'm sure that this began at some point that we could at least look back and say it started around here and for these purposes. So what do we know about that?
At the offset, I want to make clear that this is not the latest conservative lament, over decades of the liberals taking over academia, the hippies taking over the faculty lounge. In fact, those hippies, the Berkeley free speech movement in the 60s, would now be considered by today's radicals to be retrograde white supremacists. And so the issue is the illiberal takeover of higher education. And my book, Lawless, focuses on legal education, and there are failures of ideology, of bureaucracy, of leadership. And we can discuss all of those trends, certainly, but it's different palpably from when I was in college 25 years ago or law school 20 years ago. Probably about a decade ago or so is when things really shifted, as concomitant with the rise of social media and smartphones that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have written about. There's a change in teaching. There's a change in cultures. There's a change, explosion of non-teaching staffs. So whatever's going on with the faculty, it's even worse in the bureaucracy. And then weak leaders who placate and sometimes even foment the mob that prevents real education from taking place.
So you talk about law schools in the book and how they differ from academic departments. A lot of people aren't really familiar with those differences. Would you tell us about it?
Law schools aren't purely intellectual departments. They're not just grad school of a different kind where you get a PhD. In this case, you get a JD. They're practical training grounds to turn out lawyers, practicing lawyers, not professors. Law professors as well, but most people, almost everyone who goes to law school becomes a lawyer of some kind, whether it's private practice, prosecutor, what have you. While it's sad when a sociology department or an English department goes off the rails and goes crazy with critical studies, when there's, all structures are illegitimate and need to be torn down and there's no objective truth, all of this kind of postmodern theory, that's too bad for, human knowledge and the humanities and things like that. But when law schools go off the rails, that's a real problem for our society because lawyers are overrepresented among America's elites, whether we're talking about politicians or business leaders. Obviously, the legal institutions, judges and prosecutors and defense counsel that appear there, the general counsel's offices of major corporations, all of these different things. If law students come out and they're not taught to see issues from every perspective, to be able to give good advice and make zealous advocacy, whether in court, whether at the negotiating table or elsewhere, if they think that certain ways of seeing things that half of the federal judiciary agrees with, talk about originalism or textualism or these sorts of things, that's not appropriate, they're not trained for it, then our system starts breaking down. If there's a lack of confidence in the lawyers themselves about the law, then the foundations of our society, of our way of life, start crumbling.
These were certainly targeted. I mean, this didn't just happen. Who was behind this kind of takeover or this intellectual shift?
There's the story of postmodern ideology, critical studies, something that wasn't just invented in the last 10 or 20 years, kind of bubbled up in theory departments and philosophy and sociology and all these things over the 20th century. By the time I went to law school, we thought of this stuff, the crits, the critical race theory, critical legal studies in the law context. These were niche theories, something flared up in the 80s and early 90s and kind of were then relegated to academic departments, and they're not really relevant. That critical theory came back with a vengeance, and especially among younger professors who are more into activism than education, this idea that not just civil rights law or the Constitution is outmoded, but everything from securities law to water regulation, all of it is imbibed with systemic racism and patrionormativity, all of these theories of why there are power imbalances in society, and so institutions need to be torn down and rebuilt. All of that came roaring back in the last 10, 12 years or so. And at the same time as that was happening ideologically on the faculty side, and of course, faculty hire their own successors, so there can be a kind of a vicious cycle because most schools have very few, if any, non-progressives on their faculty. But at the same time as that was happening on the teaching and faculty side, the non-teaching, the bureaucratic staff was exploding to the point where for many years now, at any institution of higher education, including law schools, there are more non-teaching staff than faculty. And non-teaching staff, administrators of various kinds, student services, in the last decade, the explosion of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. These folks are far to the left of even where the faculty is. And they're not steeped in academic norms. So things like academic freedom, open inquiry, free speech, even due process, or equality under the law, these things are not necessarily values the bureaucrats, the educrats, the educational bureaucrats hold. Those bureaucracies have become the tail that wags the educational dog in many places. And then the third kind of big part of this is the deans and the university leaders, the presidents, the provosts. Not just a DEI dean and not just a head dean that defers to all of these bad trends not because the deans are themselves woke radicals, but they're careerist bureaucrats, and they give the squeaky wheel the most grease and gradually allow the cultures to be taken over. And then also the admissions deans, who especially at the so-called elite places, your Yale, Stanford, Columbia's, put a thumb on the scale for applicants who write about activism, about wanting to change the world, rather than I want to prosecute child molesters or I want to work on antitrust to make the markets more efficient for consumers, things like this that a lot of lawyers do. So you have the culmination of these various trends as well as broader societal trends, inflection points, the Ferguson effect in 2014, Donald Trump's election in 2016, COVID that addled minds, and George Floyd's killing. All of these things, these shifts that kind of inflamed society, gave oxygen to the radical left. All of these swept through academia and including dangerously law schools.
Something else that you mentioned, Ilya, in the book was the internal biases of firms and the fear over involvement with certain cases. Here in Charlottesville, where we broadcast from, there's certainly a lot of firms who are scared to go up against the University of Virginia, and they won't do it. But how widespread is this practice, and how serious is the problem?
Charlottesville is probably unique. It's in many ways, it's a one-company town. UVA looms over everything. When you go to major cities, New York and the DC environment, you have the federal government. There are other kinds of dynamics where certain types of clients, certain types of cases are considered to be politically incorrect by the firm leadership because some of their clients have been wary. For example, I talk about Paul Clement, who's one of the leading lawyers in the country, former Solicitor General, meaning the government's representative before the Supreme Court, has argued more than 100 cases before the Supreme Court. Very sought after, great litigator. And after he has not once but twice had to leave major firms, one of the AmLaw 100, the 100 biggest, most profitable firms in the country, because they didn't like his clients. Most recently, after he won a Second Amendment case at the Supreme Court, his firm Kirkland & Ellis, which has been going more in a transactional corporate law direction rather than litigation, said, despite the agreement they had when he came on, he would not be allowed to keep his client.
It sounds very dangerous for the future of America, and you actually have a case study of what's going on in Canada and what might be coming to the U.S. if we look north of the border.
I forget what the exact name of the law is, the Racial Justice Act, something like this.
Yes.
There's something comparable in California where judges are supposed to take into account people's racial and ethnic backgrounds when they're sentencing. So two people who committed the exact same crime and have the exact same prior criminal record, however long or short that might be, might get sentenced differently based on their race. It's antithetical to the idea of equality under the law. It harkens to these kind of completely racially structured societies like South Africa or other places where truly your legal standing depends on what some bureaucrat or legal official or judge determines your social credit score to be.
You had your own experience, and a great part of the book is about this experience, starting off with your lesser black woman tweet. Would you tell us about what happened and then the aftermath? This is such a scary situation, and I'm sorry that you had to go through it.
Yeah, right about 3 years ago, it was 3 years ago last week, I was due to start a new job at the Georgetown Law School Center for the Constitution, which we've learned is an important center because the rest of the law school is a center against the Constitution. Yeah. But anyhow, I was about to take this job after nearly 15 years at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank in D.C. News of Justice Breyer's retirement broke, and I was commenting on that in the media. That was the subject of my previous book, Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations in the Politics of America's Highest Court. Came back to my hotel room, was getting upset that Joe Biden was going to keep to his campaign promise to appoint a black woman. Now, there's nothing wrong with putting a black woman on the Supreme Court, but I do have a problem, most Americans do, with picking not just your justice, but your janitor based on race and sex and things like this. And so I doom scrolling Twitter late at night, not a best practice. I offered up a hot take saying, if I were Joe Biden, if I were a Democratic president, I would pick the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, the second most prestigious, powerful court in the nation, the federal appellate court in D.C. A guy by the name of Sreenivasan happens to be an Indian-American immigrant, very well respected, certainly progressive, but he is not even under consideration because of today's hierarchy of intersectionality. Again, one of these postmodern theory terms. And so we'll end up with a, quote, lesser black woman, kind of cabined by the limitations of Twitter's character limits at the time. I simply meant less qualified.
Yes.
Anybody if I was positing that candidate A was the best, the most qualified, then everybody else in the universe was less qualified. But anyway, that's how it came out. Wasn't well phrased, as I later readily admitted, but the point was clear, other than to those who maliciously misread it to mean that, I was saying that no black woman could ever be qualified and all black women were less than other people and things like that. When I woke up the next day, all hell had broken loose. I had 4 days of hell where I wasn't sure whether I'd have a career anymore. I was onboarded but suspended pending investigation by Georgetown whether I violated their rules on harassment and anti-discrimination. I don't know who I was supposed to be harassing, maybe President Biden, I'm not sure. But that investigation, it was from 4 days of hell, we went to 4 months of purgatory, if you will. That investigation very quickly became a sham, at the end of which some junior lawyer at the major law firm, they paid a bunch of money to advise them, looked at a calendar and realized that I had not been an employee when I tweeted, and so the policies don't even apply to me. So I was reinstated on a jurisdictional technicality, and while I celebrated that and looked forward to finally getting to do my job, when I got the fine print from the DEI office that investigated me, this report, they made clear that any time in doing my job that I said something or wrote something that offended people, I'd be back in the Star Chamber, back in the Inquisition. And after taking advice of counsel and my wife, who's a better lawyer than any of us, I realized that was untenable and I'd have to quit my job. So I did, in a public way, is what lawyers call a noisy exit. I published my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal, and that's available publicly. And you can see Georgetown's hypocrisy, how they essentially eviscerated their own speech and expression policy and were being created a hostile work environment for me rather than the opposite. And I've been using this platform that I've been given ever since to shine a light on the rot in higher education and especially at law schools.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with Ilya Shapiro in just a moment.
Online at schillingshow.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
SchillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
SchillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit SchillingShowMedia.com. That's SchillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. The book is Lawless, the Miseducation of America's Elites. Ilya Shapiro is our guest. I'd like to get a little more into the Inquisition that you went through. It's an appropriate term based on your experience. And were they looking for the truth, or were they just looking to nail you?
They were looking for me to bend the knee. It was a kind of a struggle session. So I only had one actual meeting with the Inquisitors. There were three of them, one person from Human Resources, two people from the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action. It was done via Zoom because this was still, even though it was spring of 2022, it was COVID mania. And so if we had met in person, then we'd all have to be masked, which would be even more surreal. So the Zoomquisition, if you will, they just kept asking, what did you mean by your tweet? And explain some more about the context in which you tweeted. Do you understand the nature of the offense that you've caused and things like this? It was banal. I was not, quaking in my boots. This was not a kind of hard-hitting legal deposition or anything like that. There was nothing to investigate. I mean, the facts were clear. My tweet was short. The law school's policies are short. You could have a junior law professor, spend 10 minutes on it and figure it all out. They had this 1 hour tweet, 1 hour Zoom, and then the thing lasted for 4 months. Clearly, they were waiting for students to get off campus to have, the dean at the beginning of it didn't want to make a decision, punted it to the bureaucrats to investigate, and at the end of it, still didn't ultimately make a decision and just, use this jurisdictional hook while wringing his hands and saying that these fundamental values in conflict, free speech on the one hand and equity on the other. It was just a sham from beginning to end. And I don't think Georgetown's leadership bathed itself in glory.
Did you have supporters who were willing to be public, or was everyone behind the scenes who was supporting you?
Both. And this is something that I learned. I got a crash course, at least a master's, if not a doctorate in crisis management. I had friends from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, for example, a very important group. I had reporters, everyone from Barry Weiss to National Review and the Wall Street Journal, who started writing and been talking about my situation. I had people behind the scenes, as you say, trying to back channel to the dean so I wouldn't be fired and things like that. So you really learn in situations like this who your friends are. And I wouldn't have wanted to learn in quite this way. I was sort of in a middle area. I wasn't just an ordinary person kind of caught up, losing my job, my bank account, what have you, with no recourse and no way to fight back. I wasn't a celebrity with, FU money and all of that. Mm-hmm. I was somewhere in the middle. I had access to media platforms. I had access to people who were savvy about dealing with these sorts of things. And I had a good lawyer, pro bono provided to me by one of these organizations. So I was fortunate in being able to have that support network.
I'd like to talk a little bit about FIRE and their involvement, because I see a lot of cases that they work on. I've interviewed them before. To what extent were they influential in this, or were they more just able to give you moral support?
No, they were very helpful. I got in touch with my friends there early on. It's ironic. I had worked with FIRE a lot over the years. I knew all of their senior staff. I had filed briefs together with them in some cases. I had filed briefs supporting their cases. I had spoken at their events. I never thought I'd be one of their clients on the other side of the table, if you will. And from the very beginning, I mean, they got everyone from the CEO, their general counsel, their head of litigation. I mean, they got the A team was behind me, and from advising me on what to do. They said never apologize, never apologize. I ultimately was advised that if I wanted to keep my job, if that was my goal, I didn't need to apologize for my failed communication, but that's as far as that went. They connected with a network of other PR folks and kind of advised me, especially in those early 4 days of hell, as I put it. And then during the process, they would periodically write a follow-up letter to Georgetown, or they would post these blog posts saying, this investigation has now lasted longer than the voyage of the Mayflower. This investigation has now lasted longer than the gestation period of a bulldog, Georgetown's mascot. These cheeky things like that. They helped organize one of 2 faculty letters that were signed on my behalf, in my support. So they stayed behind me the whole time. And as I told Greg Lukianoff, the CEO, that I hope to be one of their best fundraisers. And indeed, I've spoken at their National Gala last year, or 2 years ago now, and just recorded a podcast with them last week.
I talk frequently with John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute, who has often referenced that when he talks to law students these days, they can't even name the 5 rights in the First Amendment, and that they're essentially constitutionally illiterate. So I'd love to get your take on what's happening at the law schools today and where this leads us as a society.
Yeah, I mean, constitutionally illiterate. I've talked to professors who say that their incoming freshmen are just illiterate, period.
Yeah.
There are huge failures in our educational systems up and down. From my understanding, and again, it differs on the institution. I went to the University of Chicago Law School, which I think is certainly among the top rung, I think doing far better than anyone else on these metrics. Fever may have broken in terms of cancel culture, but not certain other things. In America writ large, we may be past peak woke, the pendulum swinging back, the vibe shift as instantiated by Donald Trump's reelection in November. But in academia, there's not so much a critical mass to push back on a lot of this stuff. And, the faculty doesn't change overnight, even in places where the state legislature in public schools gets rid of the DEI bureaucracies, which some places they try to avoid that just by renaming them or shuffling people around to the student services office and things like that. The overall culture, I think, is just not as healthy as it used to be. People are afraid to speak in class. Certain topics just aren't broached. And again, I'm not talking about headline-grabbing Supreme Court constitutional law topics. I mean, your criminal law class, discussions of hate crimes, of sexual crimes, all of these sorts of things are considered unsafe or too triggering or what have you, that you can't even discuss them. Imagine having a prosecutor or a defense attorney who didn't cover sexual assault in law school because that was considered to be too delicate and things like that. So there are definite problems, and it manifests in different ways in different institutions. And savvy educational leaders, I think, have started taking steps to better things, but it's not an overnight problem. It didn't develop overnight, and it won't be solved overnight.
So it sounds like if this is the case, if this is predominant in a lot of universities across the country, that we're in a lot of trouble in our courts and in the legal system in general going forward for the next generation. Is it that dire?
It's a big problem. And you hear, again, take away any political salience. What I hear from law firm hiring partners, from different employers, is that these young lawyers are less trained than they used to be. Even if they have sterling credentials, even if they have checked all the right boxes, are not as good at showing initiative, at knowing how to answer problems, at have to have their hand held much more than previous generations of lawyers. So I think law schools are failing at their very basic task of teaching the nuts and bolts of legal practice, quite apart from this illiberal takeover in terms of ideology.
You have finally in the book, Ilya, a turnaround plan, what we need to do. Give us just a couple points. I mean, what's going to turn the ship around?
Well, we don't know exactly, which is why I'm for all of the above strategies to try to change these things. And some, it's not necessarily industry-wide. It only takes a few good leaders at these places to start changing cultures, start changing admissions offices, start changing what goes on in class, outside of class, trainings, orientations, what have you. So it'll take external pressure. I mean, this is not a matter of, if only we make the case to the dean to, change this or that policy or hire some more non-progressive professors or something like this. There has to be external pressure, whether from state legislatures with respect to public schools, donors and alumni and trustees, who have been all too quiet. And we've seen some donor and trustee activism after October 7th, the revelation that the heart of anti-Semitism in this country is on our campuses, including in our law schools. It takes investigations by state attorneys general, by Congress. The House Education Department has been quite good in hauling university professors before it the last couple of years. Of course, the disastrous president's testimony in December of 2023, leading to the resignation of the presidents of Penn and Harvard. Department of Justice and Education investigations about civil rights denial and free speech problems that have been launched. One of these was just announced, I think, yesterday as we're recording this. And it takes private employers to say, this is no good. Deans, what are you doing? We're not going to hire people that yell at federal judges that we hope your daughters are raped and all sorts of craziness that's gone on the last number of years. It also takes alternative institutions, which is harder to do in the law school context. I mean, in undergrad, we have the experiment with University of Austin, the new institution where I just spoke 2 weeks ago. We have new centers and institutes within existing schools, Arizona State, Florida State, UNC, these things bubbling up that are great to see. In law schools, the ABA, the American Bar Association, has a monopoly on accreditation. So it's hard to even start a competing law school, even if you raise the capital and did all the things to be able to do that. That's another key reform to get rid of that monopoly. But at the end of the day, it's throwing sunlight on these things. One of the things that's been heartening to see is that, to mix metaphors, a lot of these structures are Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers. And so, for example, my colleague John Saylor at the Manhattan Institute is investigative reporter. He gets FOIA documents, Freedom of Information Act, and finds all sorts of crazy practices, hiring economists based on diversity statements, all of these various things. You saw his work a couple of weeks ago relating to University of Colorado at Boulder, similar thing at Texas Tech 2 years ago. He publishes one op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and the very next day the president or chancellor says, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. This is inappropriate. So just a little bit of sunlight, a little bit of shame has some effect if we keep the heat on otherwise.
Ilya Shapiro, if people would like to get a copy of your book, Lawless, or if they want to follow your efforts online, tell us how, please.
Well, the book's available wherever you buy books, whether it's your local Barnes & Noble physical store, whether it's Amazon.com, whether it's Walmart.com, wherever you buy books, it's available in hardcover, in Audible, in Kindle. Yeah, I think even CDs you can order somewhere if you're still listening to books on CDs, as well as my last book, Supreme Disorder. I am on Twitter or X at @iShapiro. I also have a Substack newsletter called Shapiro's Gavel, where I'm in the midst of kind of summarizing my book in 5 different posts. And you can find me at manhattan.institute. That's the website, manhattan.institute, where you can see my latest writings. I just have a piece in the Wall Street Journal today, actually, about Trump's gender executive orders. So I'm working on a lot of civil rights issues, higher ed issues, and broadly constitutional law.
We appreciate your continuing efforts, and I hope people will read the book Lawless. Ilya Shapiro, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.